40 years ago this summer. I've given away a lot. I was not much older than you, just a couple of years out of college, and I set off alone to tour northern Italy. I've been back many times. I actually lived there for 2 years while I was doing my dissertation research. But there's nothing like seeing things for the first time. I remember some of those, there's nothing like being surprised, you know? Don't worry about learning things before you go, because once you've been there, you'll be that much more motivated. I told Rachel, I like the innocent eye, you know, not full of preconceptions. So let it wash over you. You're gonna have a fantastic time. Although I assume most of you have taken 142 with Mark. So, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to give you, you know, you've all heard that Florence is the city of the Renaissance, and that's certainly true. But what I'm going to do today is to fill you in on what you might call the backstory. Florence has been a city for 2,000 years. It's not as old as some of those ancient sites of the Middle East, but it's been continuously occupied for 2,000 years. I'm going to tell you about the first 1,400 years before the so-called Renaissance of the 15th century. My research specialty, by the way, is the 14th century, which I think, of course, was the most glorious of all. But we're going to begin at the beginning with the Roman foundation of the town they called Florentia, the flourishing place, I suppose. But just to begin before the existence of the town, Florence is the principal city of the region known as Tuscany, in ancient times Etruria, the homeland of the Etruscan civilization. The Etruscans were one of many tribes that occupied the Italian peninsula, which of course was occupied for thousands of years before the foundation of Florence. By the 1st century BC, those Romans, another tribe headquartered in Rome, were expanding their area of domination, and they pacified the Etruscans by the 1st century BC. Kind of obliterated them, to tell you the truth. Once they had conquered this northern territory, they set about Romanizing it. One of the most important things they did was to build roads, long-distance highways that connected the capital city with its outlying territories and eventually reached north of the Alps to France, Spain, and England, all of which had a very extensive system of Roman roads. Florence is, I didn't bring my pointer.
You want one?
If you've got one handy. Florence was one of a number of cities found in northern Italy, both south and north of the Apennines, which is the mountain range that cuts across just north of Florence. It is located adjacent to the Arno River, which flows from east to west. And in fact, one of the first things the Romans did was to build a bridge across the Arno. Part of see that green line? That's the Via Cassia, which goes from inland from Rome, eventually ending up at the coast further north. So from the 1st century BC, there was a bridge at this point along the Arno because it's relatively narrow, easy to cross, part of the road system. There is, of course, a famous bridge there now, known as the Old Bridge, the Ponte Vecchio, on or near the site of the Roman bridge. So there has been a bridge at this site for 2,000 years. This bridge happens to be from the middle of the 14th century. The Romans had a system for laying out new towns. It was based on their system of army camps. The Latin word is castrum. A typical castrum is a walled rectangular, a defended rectangle with two major streets, a north-south street, the Cardo, and the east-west street, the Decumanus. These castra were oriented to the cardinal directions. So the main street points directly north-south and directly east-west. When I was in Florence, I would always refer to things as, north of the cathedral or south of the, people couldn't figure it out because they didn't know about the orientation of the streets. So this is a plan of Roman Florence. As I said, a walled rectangle with two major streets intersecting at the center and then a grid of streets around it. 4 gates. You would enter the city at the point where the two major streets intersect the walls. Here it is overlaid on later development, but it's pretty easy to discern. What do I push? It's pretty easy to discern the outlines of Roman Florence in this aerial view. There's the Cardo, and the Decumanus are in this way. The amazing thing is how well preserved the Roman grid is, with rectilinear blocks. This is an example of what geographers sometimes call the law of the persistence of the plan, which is to say that once boundary lines are laid out, they tend to persist. Once plots are measured, they tend to persist, except in case of catastrophe or wholesale destruction. And remember, Florence was continuously occupied. People were living here for all those 2,000 years. There's one caveat, however. Notice that the left-hand side of the town, the western side, looks even more regular than the eastern side. That's because most of this area was in fact demolished in the 19th century for a major urban renewal program. So all of these buildings are 19th century, but they still maintained the Roman grid system. Now, there's another way in which Roman practice influenced future development, and that is not inside the town, but outside the town. In addition to surveying the layout of the town itself, Roman engineers surveyed the countryside. This is a practice known as centuriation. It means dividing the land into centuries, probably 100 Roman feet on a side, precisely measuring and laying out these big squares to be allotted to the townspeople. Florence was founded as a place of settlement primarily for retired army veterans. It was a good way to secure the territory, right? To have ex-military men living on the site. So one thing you'll notice is that the streets outside the walls of Florence do not follow the north-south line of the grid. I'm pushing here. So streets just outside the Roman walls sort of veer off, or like this triangle of streets. That's because the centuriation is not oriented north-south. It's oriented to the direction of the Arno Valley. And in fact, the centuriation originally went many miles to the city of Prato, further east. So like this street, Via della Spada, this is the line of the starting point of the centuriation of the countryside. So this oblique angle was built into the Roman survey of the region. In fact, there are parts of Italy, particularly up north in the Po Valley, where from the air you can see that the Roman field lines still persist. That's how persistent these boundaries are. Now, you're not going to see any standing Roman buildings or even above ground remains when you go to Florence, again, because it's been occupied for 2,000 years. I forgot to mention, on this plan, always at the center of the Roman town, at the intersection of the two streets, was an open space known as the Forum, the civic center. This is the Forum area, much larger than the original Roman Forum area of modern Florence, the result of this 19th century redevelopment. It's the Piazza della Repubblica. But we do know a lot about what Roman Florence looked like. This is a reconstruction of the Roman Forum, which would have been a place for the market, for business. It had its own temple to Jupiter Capitolinus, a version of the Capitoline Temple in Rome itself. When this demolition took place in the 19th century, a lot of Roman remains came to light, and they've been photographed, and there are measured drawings where it was found, but it's all been buried again. There are other ways of discerning the Roman presence in Florence, however. For example, east of the Roman walls is this curious formation, a curving street, now with streets cut through it. This is the site of the Roman amphitheater, the Colosseum of Florence. You know from 141 that these were gigantic structures. They're not going away. So they were colonized, in effect. People built houses into the, I'm not saying this is the wall of the Roman Colosseum, but people, lived in the arches of the Colosseum, and gradually the original structure was covered over, built over, but its footprint remains in the city streets. This is a model of the amphitheater just east of the city walls. Somewhere under these medieval houses are the foundations or the relics of the Roman amphitheater. The one place where you will see above ground Roman structures is in Fiesole, which is in the up on the hill north of Florence. Fiesole was the original Etruscan settlement, but the Romans took it over and, among other things, built themselves a theater, which I believe you're going to visit, and there are other Roman remains visible. Now, Florence, of course, the Roman Empire lasted, maybe till the 5th century. The dates vary. But Florence was Christianized rather early, after Emperor Constantine issued the so-called Edict of Toleration in 315, making Christianity legal. Before that time, there were no large-scale Christian churches. The first large-scale Christian churches in Rome, for example, were in fact built by Constantine. So by the end of the 4th century, Florence had at least 2 Christian churches. One was just outside the walls along the exterior, the external route of the Roman road. This was the church dedicated to St. Lawrence, San Lorenzo. We know it was consecrated in 393. By the way, the canons of San Lorenzo still claim precedence in processions and things like that over the canons of the cathedral as the oldest foundation in Florence. Now, we don't know anything about the early Christian basilica. It was replaced by a Romanesque church and ultimately replaced by Brunelleschi's famous Church of San Lorenzo, which you will surely see. A few years later, maybe in the early 5th century, a second church was built just inside the walls, possibly as a more defensible site, because things were kind of rough around this time politically. This was a church dedicated to a very obscure Middle Eastern saint named Reparata. She never went to Florence. She is not buried here. Why they chose her is kind of a mystery. There are legends that she appeared at a crucial moment in a battle against the northern barbarians and saved Florence from occupation. The truth is, we don't really know. But San Lorenzo was the first cathedral, replaced rather early by the Church of Santa Reparata. So evidence of Christian monumental building by the end of the 4th century. The original church of Santa Reparata remained the cathedral until the 14th century when it was replaced. But back in the 60s and 70s, the present cathedral was excavated. Santa Reparata is directly under the present cathedral. They took out the whole floor of the cathedral and excavated beneath it and replaced it with a roof so that you can actually go down to the area under the present cathedral and see the remains of the earlier church. You can see, for example, the original early Christian mosaic pavement, which was there for 1,000 years before the new church was built, which includes this large mosaic in the center, naming all the people who donated parts of the floor. I just find this very poignant, that we know their names so much later. It says, Marianus, a deacon, made 300 square feet of this pavement. Will you have a chance to go down there?
Yeah.
And there are remnants of the earlier church. The walls, they excavated the walls of the earlier church up to about 3 feet. So you can see the base of the, about 3 feet of the walls remained standing below the present church. So you can see that. Now, we're going to vault over the long period of the so-called Dark Ages. In the case of Florence, they are pretty dark because there's not a lot of documentary or architectural evidence for what was going on. Florence was sort of a pawn in the wars between what remained of the Roman administration, Roman imperial administration, and the northern invaders. It sort of changed hands a few times. But it was, in general, in Italy, a period of contraction. Not much economic activity, not a lot of documentary evidence. So we're going to skip over to the 11th and 12th century, a period when Florence is becoming more and more prosperous based on the trade of its and manufacturing of its merchants, and increasing in population, and becoming wealthy enough to invest in large-scale building projects. One of the most picturesque sites in Florence is is on the southern side of the river. The Florentines call it the Oltre Arno, across the Arno, on a hill looking down over the city. Very striking. You can see it from the I can only think of the Italian word, the streets along the river downtown. Just look up and you'll see this church with its white marble facade. This church is dedicated to an early Christian martyr who was said to have been martyred in Florence. He was beheaded during the persecutions by the Emperor Diocletian. His name, in English we would say Minias or San Miniato. Again, he's a Middle Eastern saint. How they seized on him is kind of mysterious. The legend of San Miniato is that he was beheaded in Florence outside the gates of the Roman city, and then picked up his head and carried it to the place where he wanted to be buried, which happened to be on that mountain. San Miniato is what is known to specialists as a cephalophoric saint. A fancy word, it's Greek, a fancy word for he carried his head. He's not the only one. Saint Denis in Paris was also, martyred at Montmartre and carried his head to the place where he wanted his basilica.
Actually, they've seen images in my class of saints
Saint
holding
Denis
their
holding
heads.
his head, yeah. It's a way of justifying the location of the church, clearly. Whether San Miniato ever existed is not entirely clear. But here's this church, begun in the early 11th century. It is a prime example of Tuscan Romanesque. Now, just a little reminder, Romanesque is a 19th century term that means Roman-like. 19th century scholars who first started studying this architecture systematically noticed the many resemblances of this 11th and 12th century architecture to Roman architecture. For example, the engaged columns with foliate capitals, the hemispherical or Roman arches that form a kind of arcade across the facade. Up here, pilasters with foliate capitals, and this tabernacle window with triangular gable supported by columns. These are all very Roman elements. Now, in Italy, as opposed to France, in Italy, the memory of Rome was very strong. After all, Roman ruins are thick on the ground. You just have to go to Rome to see standing Roman buildings or remains of Roman buildings, perhaps even visible around Florence. So Italian Romanesque is much more Roman-like than its counterparts in Northern Europe. Here's the interior. Again, very Roman looking, with colored marble columns, foliate capitals. In fact, some of these are in fact spolia, that is, actual Roman columns reused from ruined Roman buildings. This is a very common practice, starting with St. Peter's in Rome, which, built by Constantine. They used columns from other Roman sites. Why not? It's cheaper. They're there. Just take them. So marble columns, hemispherical arches, with a timber roof. Unlike many Roman buildings, this building is not vaulted. Actually, it quite resembles an early Christian basilica. I almost chose this one at random. It's the Church of Santa Sabina in Rome. But arcades, arches resting on columns, a two-story elevation with clear-story windows, a hemispherical apse. The memory of Rome, as I said, remained very strong in Italy. What's distinctive about Italian Romanesque, of course, is the use of marble revetment or sheathing. Tuscany has abundant marble quarries. You've probably all heard of Carrara. Michelangelo got his marbles from Carrara. People still order Carrara marble for, the lobbies of office buildings. So particularly these two colors of marble, white and green. So Tuscan Romanesque takes advantage of the availability of this local material, combines the Roman-like elements with these geometric patterns executed in different colored marbles. And let's just see the close-up. So in that sense, it's not Roman at all, but something new, something characteristic of the 11th century. You'd never mistake this for a Roman building, despite the Roman articulation. And of course, the great monument of the Florentine Romanesque is right downtown, almost in the center of the city. This is the baptistry. In Italy, it was customary from the earliest days of Christianity, from the 4th century, the time of Constantine, to have a separate building where the ritual of baptism was performed, that is, induction into the Christian church. By the way, early Christians didn't baptize babies, only adults could be baptized. There was probably a baptistry here on this site from the early Middle Ages. This building dates from the 11th century. It stands directly opposite the cathedral. Here too, more evidence of the Florentine awareness of their Roman heritage. By the 14th century, some people had sort of willfully forgotten that this was a medieval building. The great chronicler of Florence wrote that it was actually a temple of Mars that had been adapted for Christian use. Not true. Propaganda, I would say. But here too, those Roman architectural elements are combined with the distinctive Tuscan incrustation. So we've got pilasters with foliate capitals, Roman moldings, side by side with these decorative inlays. Or here again, a blind arcade. In other words, columns attached to and arches attached to the wall with a kind of echo in mosaic. Look particularly at the windows. Again, like San Miniato with triangular gable. One interpretation of the Florentine baptistry is that it's actually a kind of copy of the Pantheon in Rome, the great building commissioned by Hadrian in the 2nd century, and one of the few Roman imperial buildings that is more or less intact, that has remained visible since the 2nd century. Why do we think this? It's not a copy, it's a version. I mean, for example, here are the tabernacles inside the Pantheon, and here are the windows on the baptistry. I spelled baptistry wrong. Here is the interior. Christian baptistries are most typically central plan, that is, symmetrical around a central point. Some are circular, this one happens to be octagonal. Interestingly, this is the apse where the altar was. For many centuries, there was a baptismal font in the center of the building. I don't know how long this practice endured, but at least until Dante's day, every single Florentine was baptized in the baptistry. He called it Il Bel San Giovanni. So it's still very dear to the hearts of all Florentines. In fact, St. John the Baptist is one of the patron saints of the city of Florence. The feast of the Nativity, the birth of St. John the Baptist, is June 24th. I've had the luck to be in Florence on occasion on June 24th, and they have the most fantastic celebration of the Feast of San Giovanni, the best fireworks in the world over the river, and all kinds of pageantry and so forth. Now, here again, that combination of Romanesque incrustation and Roman-like elements. In fact, the interior articulation of the baptistry is remarkably similar to that of the Pantheon. This is what gives rise to this idea that they were, in a sense, creating a local version of the Pantheon. Look at this. The Pantheon, of course, has alternates flat walls with recessed niches, pilasters framing the niches, and columns seeming to support the entablature. The same arrangement at the Florentine Baptistry, these monumental piers with columns in front of the recessed niches. One spectacular feature of the baptistry, of course, are these gold ground mosaics, which narrate Christian history, culminating in the Last Judgment. And be sure and take a look at, the good people are over here, going up into heaven, and the bad people are over here, being devoured by, literally devoured by the devil. It's quite impressive. Just wanted to point out that buildings like this aren't frozen in time. The baptistry, Florentines continued to embellish and ornament the baptistry for centuries. So the mosaics are actually of the 13th century. And you've probably heard of the 3 sets of bronze doors, that very expensive embellishments to the baptistry. 1 set from the 14th century, 2 sets executed by Lorenzo Ghiberti in the 15th century, the famous Gates of Paradise as described by Michelangelo, and you will see those. Also, I might point out the baptistry, the cupola of the baptistry, it's not a dome because it's octagonal. The cupola of the baptistry is a double shell construction. It has one profile on the outside and a different profile on the inside. Surely something studied very carefully by who? Brunelleschi, when he devised the double shell cupola of the cathedral in the 15th century. Now, as I said, by the 12th century, Florence was growing. Her economy was flourishing. The basis of the Florentine economy was the wool trade. That means processing wool, raw wool, which was imported from as far away as England, processing it and turning it into woolen cloth, which was then exported. Florence was famous throughout Europe for the quality of its woolen cloth. So people were making, the merchants in woolen cloth were making money hand over fist. So much so that by the 12th century, it was decided to expand the city by constructing a new circuit of walls. This is always an extremely expensive operation. But probably what they were concerned about was that there had been so much development and expansion outside the Roman